All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Talia. I am presenting on Erickson's developmental stage, stage number 5, identity versus identity and or role confusion. My neighbor was gracious enough to let me probe into his life, Mr. Russo. So we had it was about an hour and a half conversation um, about his life and certain things that kind of shaped who he is today. So, again, this took place late grade school, early high school, um, and this stage is adolescents are exploring who they are and developing their sense of identity. So, a lot of these experiences that Mr. Russo um, had around this age kind of really shaped, again, like I said, who he became as a as an adult today. Um, so a lot of what Mr. Russo told me was about, again, the experiences that he had in grade school and then with his father and grandfather. So one of the big lessons that he learned at a young age was that all rules do not get you where you need to go. Um, One of the experiences that he had told me about was he was in school taking a diocesan math exam, and the um, the nun, there were nuns back then, the nun had turned to him and asked him, because he was finished his exam, to help his fellow classmate finish his exam. Now, normally cheating or helping on an exam would be, you know, kind of forbidden, and they would have definitely gotten punished if they were ever caught doing such a thing. So, he stated that he kind of looked at her like, "What, you're asking me to, you know, cheat?" So, he had to do what he was told, so he turned around and helped his classmate finish his math exam. So that same nun, a few years later, had given Mr. Russo the title of, he was on the safety committee. So Mr. Russo ended up showing a nun that he was able to open a locked door with his penknife, and he made sure that I knew that back then that was allowed, carrying little pen knives around. So he was all excited, and he showed the nun, um, how he could open up the door. And the nun ended up telling him that that was evil, and to do that, it was a sin. So he, obviously didn't do it again. Now, 2 weeks later, that same nun, while escorting 300 students back up the hallway, I guess from the lower level, she had forgotten her keys. Now she turned to Mr. Russo, and after summoning the 300 and some odd students back down the hallway, she asked Mr. Russo to unlock the door because she knew that he, in fact, could. So, again, asking him to do something that she had previously told him was unacceptable, inappropriate, something that was not allowed to be done. She asked him to do that. So what Mr. Russo kind of got from those experiences, that violating the rules were in fact what should have been done in that particular situation. So, he said that, throughout his life and his jobs and, you know, um, things like that, it's not all black and white. And he made sure that I knew that he was very much a fan of the gray area. But it was from these experiences or these situations, these occurrences that happened at such a young age, it shaped his thought process for the future. Now, some of the difficult challenges that he was kind of battling during this time was, deciding if in fact the rules were meant to be broken. So, okay, so he broke these 2 rules, but that's because he was told to. So does that mean that, he was able to break other rules? He was very much confused at this point. Another situation that he had told me about was he spent a lot of time with his grandfather and his father, both of which kind of had funny personalities in the sense that they would use insults and humor as a way to, either relate to somebody or, start a conversation, which later Mr. Russo told me was a way that they could get their point across, but also not let anybody know who they really were, kind of hiding their true colors. Not in a negative way, but, they were uncomfortable with showing people who they really were, so they used humor and insults to kind of bridge the gap between themselves and then, one of the stories was the person behind the deli counter. So, Mr. Russo kind of had a difficult time figuring out how to be himself and then without divulging too much information to others. He said that he, from a young age, learned to kind of be a strong but silent type. That's how he described both his grandfather and his father. And he ended up learning that way, that, strong but silent type, worked for him. That's what he wanted to do. That's how he wanted to act. And he was comfortable with, not getting too comfortable with people. He said that this also impacted his relationships with both his friends and, people that he wished to get to know a little bit more intimately. He had a difficult time kind of opening up. Later on down the road, got married, kids, this, that, and the third, but it was definitely a struggle for him, figuring out how to, be himself but not be himself, if that makes sense. One of the a big kind of turning point for Mr. Russo in his life during this stage was the loss of his grandfather. Like I was saying before, his grandfather acted as a second father figure in his life. Learned kind of how to be a man from his grandfather and his father as well. But, there's, a lot of times there's this special connection with grandparents, and that was definitely the case for Mr. Russo. So trying to pick up the pieces after the loss of his grandfather was definitely something that was difficult for him. Also at that age, he shared with me kind of, you're lost, you're trying to figure out who you are as a person, and you're not kind of mentally stable at that stage. It's identity versus identity and role confusion. So you're definitely kind of up in the air about everything. And then to have to suffer that large of a loss, definitely impacted him. Again, talking about the loss of his grandfather, Erikson explains that this is when the child is learning about themselves, like I said, and trying to figure out who they are as a person. So when Mr. Russo lost one of the 2 people that he kind of learned his behaviors from, you know, it was definitely a shock for him. Now, he had mentioned that, you know, he grew up in Atlantic City in a large Jewish family. He was always taught that family was always number one above all else. So because of that, you know, way of thinking and way of being brought up, you know, this definitely intensified his relationship with his grandfather, making it, you know, that much harder to cope after, you know, he lost him. So, you know, he was raised to really, you know, value his time, value his relationship with his grandfather, and then to lose him at such a young age, you know, it was definitely a shock. Now, for one of my annotated bibliographies, there was a study about family interaction between mother and father, and then just mother, and then just father, about how the more time you spend with them, one parent or both, how it kind of affects your overall self-confidence, self-worth, overall competency. So it was a very interesting study. But according to one of the authors, youths who spent more dyadic time with their fathers on average had higher general self-worth, and changes in social time with fathers were positively linked to changes in social competence. So since Mr. Russo did spend most of his time with his father, and then, you know, I definitely think, you know, a grandfather would kind of fit into that. According to Lamb et al., it was a good indicator of his overall self-worth, in the sense that, you know, he definitely had a lot of things going for him, as you know, according to this study. You know, he did, his mother was in the picture, but I guess back then, you know, you kind of hung out with dad more. So definitely saw a, you know, a positive connection between the study that was done in 2012 versus, you know, Mr. Russo's experiences, and, you know, he, you know, became wildly successful in his, you know, in his 20s. So that kind of, you know, makes sense with everything that we're talking about. Another theory that I was, excuse me, looking at, social learning theory. People are socialized to think and behave in certain ways. So again, right off the bat, you know, Mr. Russo spending so much time with his father and his grandfather, kind of imitating or mirroring their behaviors, you know, kind of definitely led him, you know, down the road of, you know, thinking and acting like his elders. Another theory that I chose Piaget's theory of cognitive development. I am actually going to stop here and start back up with another video, so that I don't cut off in the middle of a slide. All right, one moment.